might be performing. So kind of be aware that not everything in red means that it's problematic, but kind of, you need to be contextual. Certain servers may perform a lot better with certain counters. Depends on the hardware and the load that you have against those. But you probably want to have a baseline, and this is a good way of starting to capture that level of information from a baseline perspective here. Get to the next screen. Now, I'm going to go and touch on the Distributed Replay Controller, DRC, a little bit more. But one of the things I do want to point out that since 2008, we've had the extended events capability. So extended events is really our kind of replacement tool suite that we want to use going forward. It's a lot more lightweight in terms of the overhead that it puts on the system. It's more highly predicated, and it can do kind of analysis that we weren't really able to perform before. One of the problems, though, currently that we have with Profiler versus extended events is that, we can't actually use the output from extended events currently that in our current kind of format today to perform replay operations like in Profiler, or use that information with Distributed Replay Controller. So just to confirm, Profiler replay trace files, or the trace files from Profiler, will be required for Distributed Replay Controller. You cannot use the output from extended events for that. But what we can do is stuff like query tracking, detailed tracking. We can do sampling on the system a lot better. We can capture events, and also we can kind of make those changes to what events we're capturing, what information we're looking for, really kind of on the fly. So very, very kind of much more heavily predicated, much less of an overhead, but predominantly we don't have to keep stopping and starting our Profiler sessions every time we want to make a change. And we can actually read the output of those as well through various methods, and there's many different targets. Extended events is a whole big area. I won't have time to go into the specifics, but I just wanted to point out that this is one of the kind of issues with Distributed Replay at the moment, is we can't use extended events data session data at this time. So this is when I was going to go and jump into a DRC demo, kind of with the time that we have, and actually the views that you have. So I usually kind of have, I do have on this machine that I'm going to show you now, I have many different VMs. I have a whole kind of environment. I have a distributed, I have a domain controller, Active Directory server. I have a SQL Server installation, which is a 2012 installation. I have a admin server, that where my management console is, as well as the Distributed Replay Controller service is actually running on there. And then I have a couple of client applications, kind of VMs as well. What I'm going to do, I'm actually just going to switch across to my VM environment, which I'm just going to do now. So just kind of show you quickly that in my machine I have my domain controller, I have my SQL Server installation. Scroll in a little bit so you can kind of see. I have my domain controller, my SQL Server system, my admin server. This is where I have Management Studio, etc., and a couple of clients. And I also have here, you can see a 2012 STP2, CTP2 one there as well. So I may be going to take a workload that I'm running currently on 2012 and actually just run it directly against a 2014 release and see what impact that has. So these are the kind of scenarios I will be using the tool for. But I'm going to go and kind of can see that this is, well, that's already been run. So I go back to this one. There we go. So first off, what I'm going to do is, this is that virtual environment that I was talking about, and you can see here I've got some IP addresses, and it's not a big machine, it's just a laptop in essential terms, 24 gig RAM, and I'm using about 18 gig of those across the various VMs that I have, and you can see the specification of how many CPUs and memory each one has here. But this is just a simulation for actually using kind of load testing. And what I find is, what you might want to do is actually have an environment, something similar to this, a virtual VM environment that you can kind of configure, set it up so that it simulates the same kind of configuration and number of servers and kind of installations of applications, etc., the versions of installs that you might have. Then you can kind of make sure that this is ready and running, and when you go through your test cycle, you can kind of validate it against your virtual environment. maybe do some testing, and then also kind of capture, make sure everything works. What you can then do is, when everything's working, take that and replicate those processes on your live kind of environment. So not the live production environment, but your live testing environment, your live UAT environment. So what I normally do is I have my virtual environment to play with, my sandbox. I can spin these up and down and break them and play with them. When I've kind of got things ready, I can then move that over to my testing environment, run the same processes, make sure everything works, and then I can kind of know that I'm not going to break anything probably in my test environment and have to spend many hours fixing those problems. But this is kind of one of the things. But I do a lot of testing in virtual environments now as well, because they do simulate a lot of the live production systems out there that are in virtual configurations now. So this is becoming more and more popular as a configuration kind of setup. For those who've not seen Distributed Replay Controller before, there are a few preparation steps that we need to go through. So once we install, which is through the installation of features, one of those features would be Distributed Replay Controller, and another feature is known as Distributed Replay Client. So you would determine which one you're going to install on which of your systems. Now, you can only have one controller within your for each server that you're going to connect with there, and then you can have up to 16 client applications that run in the Distributed Replay Client. So that allows us to scale up to 16 different clients for one controller for a specific installation. Now, obviously, you can have multiple systems installed, and you can have maybe different controllers throughout, but each of those clients would only be kind of configured to probably run against one of the controllers. So you might kind of have just a few clients, and then you have to do a few configuration changes to kind of point which controller you're going to use. But normally you'd probably just use one client against one client computer, one client service, and then run that against one Distributed Replay controller. But there are some firewall rules that you need to set up, as we can see on the screen here, as well as client permissions for making sure you can log into those servers and run the various kind of client service accounts that each one is running. I do recommend, as you would for SQL Server itself, you would run probably a service account for SQL Server. So you do have dedicated service accounts for both your controller and for your service, etc. as well. What I'm going to do, I'm going to see if I actually have my services tab running. Let me have a quick look. So you can see here that just for my installation, I actually have the NT service ones here, which are installed by default, but I probably would have domain controller ones for my installation of maybe my virtual environment, or my live systems, or my test systems would also have domain accounts. So for my laptop, it's not really necessary, but for the main production systems, I would have that. If I jumped into the domain controller and Active Directory, I would actually show you all that information, but it's not that important to see at this point here. Let's come back again. There we go. There's also some post-installation steps. So just making sure you've done those firewall rules, you've got your client permissions, and any other login SQL permissions that you need to have so that you can authenticate against that SQL server and actually get access to those databases that you're running those replay trace events against. You need to have the right rights in order to perform those replay operations. So, if you're using applications to kind of connect, and that's the normal way that you do your approach of connecting via applications to your SQL server for maybe your web service or some other application, then you probably want to make sure that you're testing along the same lines as that security as well. Often I see people test stuff, and then when they go into the live system and they apply it, it's kind of, oh, things weren't quite 100% because maybe they haven't tested the security aspects, and they haven't tested it in the same methodology the way we'd lose it into a live system. So let's go to the next one. So here's the quick review of the kind of keywords that the Distributed Replay XE runs, and there's 4 of those. There's pre-process. I'm going to come back and describe these in turn. Replay, status, and cancel. So the pre-process, this is effectively creates what's known as intermediate files. Each of those intermediate files would then be spread across to one or more different client distributed replay clients. And when those intermediate files are processed, they could be processed in a synchronization method. Start that again. They could be replayed synchronously, so they're basically using the same timestamps and the same kind of durations of time that happened in real time when these were prepared and run earlier. Or we can have those in a stress mode. So each of those outputs and trace elements of the commands that are being run could be actually executed at a real time or faster real time, effectively, when we're doing the stress mode. The replay is effectively going to determine what the controlling working directory is, the target server where we're kind of connecting to, which clients we're going to have. The configuration file is what mode we're in. Are we in stress mode or synchronization mode? And what is the status interval? So if we're going to reduce down the durations between the kind of commands being run, are we going at 50% speed, i.e. are we reducing the wait time by 50% or down to 20%, these type of things. We can also get a status interval to say where the feedback from those servers, from those commands are coming through. So that was the early configuration file, was the adjusting of the kind of replay operations, being a 1-to-1 or a 5-to-1 or whatever the ratio is that we want to have for both thinking time and connection time, so things between events. Status and cancel are pretty self-explanatory. Basically, give me a status output of what the controller's doing, how many operations it's performed, kind of that level of information. And the cancel will effectively kind of, very efficiently shut down those operations in a smooth way. So you're not just kind of putting the plug on the whole process and leaving open transactions and stuff. We're going to kind of spin things down properly. There's more information for each of those verbs. We can kind of see that by doing that. And it's effectively in the program files, SQL Server tools, and it will be 110 or 120 tools bin. And then there'll be an application called dreplay.exe. And this is what we're going to do. And we're going to do a command line, and we're going to kind of execute the pre-process operation first, create those intermediate files, and then we're going to push those out, and then we're going to be able to run the replay operation and actually have that replay working on the system. One of the things you will probably need to make sure is that you have your perfmon counter collections running in the ahead of time, so that when you start replaying, you're not going to miss any maybe critical events. You want to make sure those things are up and running first, and then have those scaled down. So probably leave a minute or two, ahead and after each of the kind of replay operations, so that you allow things to spin up and spin down again, and you capture all those event activity effectively as well, because there could be some significant stuff in there. So we touched on earlier, this was the Profiler replay events, so just making sure that we have that kind of viewed and seen there. And what we're going to do here is, I'm not going to go into the demo again. I'm just showing you kind of the screen just for really kind of purposes of you making sure that you remember this stuff. One of the things though, if you're connecting with certain provider types, make sure that you've got the right provider type for the connection to the right server. So you can kind of see what you're connecting against. And which provider. So sometimes there's issues people have encountered, and it's usually around kind of the version and the provider type that they're using more than anything else. So I'm going to go in and quickly look at the SQL.io tool, and also we kind of some of the other tools in the time we have remaining, which is about 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to kind of take some questions. So SQL.io, for those who are not familiar with this, is kind of not a SQL Server specific tool. It's just the naming of it. It's kind of it's an I/O performance baseline tool. So the name of it, SQL.io, kind of a little bit misguided in some ways there, but effectively allows us to kind of test the subsystem, the I/O subsystem itself. Invariably, probably is the one that SQL Server is going to be using, and we can kind of see how well that performs. And what we would do is we run this SQL I/O tool with varying switches and values. So here's some examples of some of the values that we would probably run this for. Oops, sorry, let me do that again. Go back a level. Oops. There we go, and see if I can do this without messing up this time. So here's some of the values that we saw. So you can see here there's f random, there's also f sequential, there's -t, which is the number of threads to run simultaneously, the number of outstanding requests per thread. So -08 would be 8 outstanding threads queued. So you can kind of play with a number of different values here to see the performance of how well that server performs under different loads. And against the test file would invariably be kind of representing a database in a sense. So you might have maybe a 200 gig database. What you might want to do is actually create a test file that would mimic the size of that. Now, obviously, you need a large system for a 200 gig one, but it's no good probably just putting a couple of 100 megs worth of test file and then your live system's 200 gig. There's too much of a disparity in size there. So you might want to kind of look at having a few different test file sizes and making sure that when you test against those, kind of the performance of the characteristics of these parameters kind of are fairly reasonable from one to the next. Now, one of the things is actually looking at the output of these, and let me just quickly show you an output that we have. So I'm going to skip across to one of the folders here. So what we have, if I go to, I think it's desktop, let's see if I can pull up the folder I had earlier. Nope, I think it's documents actually. There we go. So here's an example of one that I did, the output of SQL I/O that we were doing on a system that I was testing a while back. And you can see here the output of the system effectively is pretty much this information here. How many IOs per second, megabytes per second, some latency values, and then also we have the histogram to show you kind of how well that server performed. We can see the size of the current file, we can see which drive it was on, and kind of some other key information here. And basically this is going through capturing the output for each one of these as it goes through and does a different kind of set of characteristics here. So we're basically performing a number of different tests here. And what I'm going to do is to analyze this information and kind of make sense of this. It's not an easy thing to do. But thankfully there are some clever folks out there that kind of know how to use PowerShell very well. And one of those is Jonathan Cahias, and he's been doing this for a long time. I've noticed that, and I had some similar ones which I've used, but this one I'm going to use Jonathan's for. Basically going to run a script that's going to pass the output of the SQL I/O tool and then create a nice Excel workbook for us with some charts that allows us to look at that. And this is basically one that we did earlier. So basically I created I ran the script, I pointed it to that file, this was the file I pointed it to, and basically we can see the throughput. We can see kind of where, okay, well the most throughput I had was on these characteristics here, was in, get the, oops, cursor to follow me. Oh, I'm going to use Zoom it then instead. There we are. There we go. So you can see here the most we had was these values here. But I might be doing some different analysis. We also have the number of IOPS, so how many IOPS we're getting through, that's a different set of data. And here's that raw data set that was coming through. And we can kind of go in and look at these numbers and find some averages and work out which of these would be beneficial for us. And also SQL Server performs kind of operations in certain types of loads there. So the number of sequential or random operations, how many kind of the block size of those operations, etc. So are we doing 8K random reads or 64K sequential reads, for example, or writes? So what those are, so we can kind of see the throughput. And this is something you probably want to perform, fairly frequently. Capture the information, make sure that there's nothing kind of maybe suddenly dropped in performance. That's maybe something I've seen before where to deploy a system later on, suddenly things are not working half as well, and there's maybe like fragmentation right across the volume, for example, is often a problem for these type of performance drops. But we can see from doing these type of easy analysis, and effectively it's basically creating maybe a batch file with all those configuration options available. You run them maybe overnight or kind of a key off period times, capture the information, run it through PowerShell, get an Excel file, and then you're good to go. So those are the kind of things that we can easily do with those. So go to the next slide. So that was the quick PowerShell one. So I'm going to quickly jump on to one of the other tools and some of the benefits and also some of the problems that you might encounter with this tool. So the tool I'm talking about is Data Tuning Advisor, or known as DTA, those three-letter acronyms that were commonly being associated with all applications these days. So let me quickly jump into Management Studio again and show you kind of some of the processes that we're looking for. So I'm just going to, oops, so we can get the, why is that not doing that? There we go. So Management Studio, oops. There we go. So I'm going to the Tools menu again. This time I'm going to Data Tuning Advisor. So this is going to open up another connection to this server, because we're going to connect to the same one again. Just waiting for that. Let's try that again. Let's see if I've got that for some reason. So it's taking its while to come up for some reason. Okay. Yeah, I might have a few too many applications open. Okay, let's close a couple of these down. For some reason it's okay. Not sure why I'm not getting that profile comes up. I think so. Here we go. For some reason it's one of those GoToMeeting webinar ones. Sometimes the screens disappear on you for a second. So here we are. We have a couple of screens here now that are called Data Tuning Advisor. So this basically is the internal feature called Data Tuning Advisor, DTA, that we're going to potentially use for not only kind of just tweaking the performance characteristics of the configuration, so maybe looking at partitioning invariably for the system, etc., and these type of things. I'm just going to try and close down a couple of these windows in a second. But while we're waiting for that to come up, let me just, here we go. Get rid of a couple of these. Okay, that's going to take a second or two to come up, so I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint slide for a second. So while we're waiting for that to exist, effectively on the production system, we're probably going to have a database. We're probably going to also have a test system, and we're going to have maybe a restored version of that database on there. We're going to make sure we have the right users and logins mapped and everything's kind of correct so we can jump in. And we're going to use the Data Tuning Advisor to perform some tuning operations. But invariably for a load testing scenario, we want to see if there's maybe use for partitioning, if there's actual identification of index usage, query distribution among tables, ways of kind of constraints that might be on the database, etc., in terms of performance. All these kind of things, we can kind of perform some analysis, perform that against the test system, and get recommendations about changes. We can then use those changes that are being recommended to drive ways of evaluating, can we improve the performance of the load test? So I'm not saying that we should be seeing and making use of the Data Tuning Advisor application as a load testing tool directly, but is using it as a generation tool for finding out things that we can tweak in the environment. So I'm just going to see if I can close a couple of these applications, because I think we've overused everything a little bit. Let me just close a couple of these, and we should be good to go, I think, on the Data Tuning Advisor. So here I'm going to choose the server that we're currently connected to. Now what you notice is there will be some additional previous sessions that have been run, and some of those sessions also will have information about recommendations that they already have. So what we can do is we can jump into those previous sessions and actually go and look at some of the reports that are available. So maybe the data access report or the recommendations of which indexes can be removed or added, the estimation on the improvements, partial recommendations if there's any. While we're waiting for that process to go through, we can kind of see the performance of that. But invariably, you'll probably run this overnight, maybe determining the tuning options that you're going to use, limit the tuning time, so maybe stopping it before key operations are going to start, determining whether you're going to use different PDS structures, physical design structures. So do I want to just evaluate existing structures, or do I want to look at maybe adding new index views or indexes or filtered indexes? Am I looking at partitioning? No, these are the things I can do. Now if I go to the one that we don't have at the moment, there's also a number of advanced ones as well. And effectively what you're going to do is probably just generate all recommendations offline. What will happen then is you'll have the ability to take the recommendations and the actions that exist. So let me go to the previous one there. And I can basically look at evaluating those recommendations or applying the recommendations. And I can basically determine which recommendations I might want to try out and actually apply. So these are the things that I would probably do. I'm then probably going to want to create the session and maybe even export that session and save that. And you may be able to import session definitions if you wanted to do advanced stuff as well. So this is kind of where we basically wanted to get into the point where we actually have these tuning recommendations. And this is the key bit. I want to use the tuning recommendations to identify improvements that I want to test with my strategy here. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I think we're pretty much, I'm not going to go for the demo because we don't really have time, but effectively it's going to just scroll through, test those statements out, look at options for improving the performance of that, and coming up with those recommendations of things to add or remove. So that was the rough agenda that we covered. Obviously, we didn't do the Distributed Replay Controller demo, but effectively it's command line and it's very easy to do. I'm going to generate some kind of video ones of the specific demos I had, so those will be available shortly in the next week or two. So you'll be able to kind of see what I was when I did that presentation before. And I'll also probably put the DTA one in as well, and have all the demos effectively for the session available for you to view later on as well. So that's pretty much, I think, the main view of the time you have. So just to summarize, when we're going through and doing load testing, we want to make sure that we have capturing the right information. So probably perf non-counters for sure, but there's also a number of other DMVs specifically that you might want to counter, so like the weight stats analysis and other snapshots of what's been executed as it runs, maybe the index usage operational stats and index usage stats, these type of things. We have a number of tools available to our disposal. So 2014 includes now Distributed Replay Controller, but we have Profiler, we have the other DTA tools and other tools that are free like Hammer and Workload Generator, for example. I'm going to see there's questions now that we need to go through in the last couple of minutes we have. Let's have a look to see what those are. And why I got that, I'm just going to leave up the past listing because there's a lot of community information available to you. Other webcasts that have been done by virtual chapters and the past summits, etc. If you need to get the session recordings for the last few years of past, they're all there. So let me go to the chat window. Sorry, wrong one. I'm going to bring up the right window. Okay, I don't see any chat window at the moment, so I'm going to see if there's any actual questions that you guys have in the last couple of minutes we have today.
There's a few under the questions window.
Oh, is there? Okay, let me see if I can go to the questions window. One sec. Why am I not seeing that? Okay. I'm being a bit, okay, why am I not seeing the questions window? View. Okay, I can't see the questions window in my display here. Can you see them there? Do you want to read out one of the questions? Because I've not seen it in my screen here. I'm not sure why.
Sorry. Are there additional performance counters you would recommend when testing a virtualized SQL server?
Excellent question. So I'll repeat the question. Are there additional performance counters for kind of monitoring virtualization servers? So yes, there are a number of VM counters. Invariably, you probably want to go to the VM software like vSphere Server Center, for example, to capture that information. And those usually kind of have maybe like a 20-second interval times interval. So you probably would look at the performance counters directly from the virtual machine, but they're going to give you a certain view that the operating system thinks it has for the resources. You also want to correlate that with the VM counters effectively as well and kind of make sure that everything is good. There are a number of products out there on the market that will help you with that. But yes, being in the VM counters as well, I would recommend for virtualized environments. What specific counters those are, you're probably going to, it's going to basically depend on what you're trying to achieve with your analysis and your load testing scenario at that time. I'll see if I can pull a few together and put those in a blog follow-up that I'm going to do next week on this session.
If we use Profiler during regular business hours, it makes the database slow. Is the best practice to run Profiler after work hours?
So you probably want to run what's known as server-side traces as opposed to Profiler. Profiler gives you that GUI interface that allows you to see what's happening and what's being captured. The server-side tracing effectively will allow you to perform the same data capture, but you're going to capture it to a file, a trace file, and you can then do the performance analysis later. Now, when you capture that information is dependent on what you're trying to perform. If you're going to have a production system that's live and you're trying to analyze the performance of impact on the system at the time, there's no point trying to run it later on in the day. You're not going to have the right information. You need to run it kind of as it is then. But you want to keep your minimum workload of event classes and data columns down to a minimum. So I'd recommend use your filter capabilities inside a Profiler. Filter for specific database IDs, for example, or just make sure that you're not capturing everything under the sun, and monitor the workload increase and overhead that Profiler has. That's why extended events effectively is replacing it, because it has a much lower overhead, but we can't do replays with that at this time. Do we have any more questions there? So I think we're kind of pretty much on the hour. I'm happy to answer some more questions.
Okay. Does performing the replay in the Profiler actually execute the same transactions against the database again, or does it just simulate the execution items in a kind of offline environment?
So great question. Basically the trace itself is going to execute the exact same commands that it's captured. So this is why you need to be aware of things like the ANSI settings that are on the system and other information. the trace it's basically doing is capturing what commands have been executed at what timestamps and what the, when we're doing a replay maybe that's in a time sequence event, we're replaying it maybe at the same time frame sequence. We can see kind of the impact of how much resources, how quick that process ran, maybe on a different server. So, you know, it maybe took a minute on the production system, but you test it on the test system, and you make a tweak, maybe a new index, and it's running in 30 seconds. You can see the change in the performance. So that's why maybe the data columns like reads and writes, the number of reads and writes maybe are something also you want to capture. But, you know, you're performing the same operations, but you can control the sequence of those a little bit by stepping into it one by one, or have it just replay in the same time sequence. And Distributed Replay Controller will allow you to adjust those time frame sequences to a much shorter interval and a stress mode as well, if needed. I think we've got time probably for 2 more questions at this time with the clock running on as it is. So I don't know how many more questions we have. If there are more, by the way, I can do a Q&A answer up follow on this later.
If there's certain types of workload that does not replay correctly, I captured a replay trace on a data warehouse server for several hours, and then when I replayed it, it ran in a minute or so. I had trouble verifying whether the workload I captured and what ran in the replay were the same. It appeared to not match at all.
Okay, I mean, it could be that when you ran it initially, there were large gaps of time between those events that are not being, those time frames between each of those events were not being kind of captured. Or you could have had a lot of lock-in on the system, blocking occurring that's stopping those events running. So you need to be looking at the output that comes from those replay events, and looking also at other information like DMVs to look at maybe the performance of those statements. So one of the things I do have and use is the standard reports that come with SQL Server that give you maybe object execution statistics and, you know, the top SQL and the top IO and the top CPU statements. And you can clear those before each run, before, you know, and see kind of what the changes were between maybe your production system and your test system. So clear it on your test system, run them, and then look at those values and compare them to what they were for those same statements on the live system. Again, a number of tools out there that help with that analysis, but we were talking about SQL Server tools for this session, so I've stepped away from third-party tools in that analysis phase, but it's a difficult thing to do sometimes.
Well, Neil, I wanted to thank you for your time and for your presentation. I will be sending you the question log, and you'll be able to answer anything that may be on your blog that you hadn't answered today. I also wanted to mention that Diane Scott is the winner of the Amazon gift card. This is sponsored by Dell Software, and she will be notified later today about that. So thank you very much, Neil, for your time and for your presentation.
Sure. I appreciate everyone that's spent time to come out today.